Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're digging into some really foundational ideas about how we make choices, especially in economics. Think of it as understanding the why behind markets.
Mm-hmm.
And we're drawing on two, giants. Carl Menger's Principles of Economics and, of course, Ludwig von Mises' huge work, Human Action.
Foundational texts, definitely.
And our mission today, really, is just to pull out some core insights. What drives us, what we value, the basic logic of it all. So let's jump in.
Sounds good. And it's interesting where both Menger and von Mises start with just a simple good.
Right.
Menger makes this great point that something only actually becomes a commodity when you intend to trade it. It's not like stamped on the object itself.
So it's a temporary status.
Exactly. A phase. It exists purely for that exchange, until it reaches whoever is actually going to use it. So an apple isn't always a commodity.
Only when it's on the way to being sold or eaten by someone else.
And the key thing there is the intention behind it. It shifts focus from the object to the person's plan for it.
Okay, and Mises really picks up on that idea of intention, doesn't he? With his focus on human action.
He does. He makes what sounds like a really bold claim, actually,
Right.
that all human action is necessarily rational.
Necessarily rational. Okay,
Yeah.
unpack that a bit.
Yeah.
Because we often call actions irrational.
Right. And Mises would say that term rational action is almost redundant, like saying wet water. It's built into the definition of action itself.
So what does he mean by rational then?
Well, crucially, he's not judging the goals. He isn't saying your aims have to be sensible or efficient or what someone else would choose. It just means that when we act, we are purposefully trying to achieve some desired end using means we believe will get us there. So applying rational or irrational to the ultimate ends, why you want what you want, is kind of meaningless from this perspective.
Because that's down to personal values, individual desires.
Exactly. Your reason for collecting stamps, say, might seem odd to me, but the act of collecting is purposeful for you. It's aimed at an end you value.
Got it. So it's about the conscious choice, the aiming towards a goal. And he distinguishes this from just like reflexes.
He does. It's a key distinction. Think about touching a hot stove. Your hand pulls back instantly.
Reflex. No thought involved.
Right. That's a reactive response of your body. But deciding to put on oven mitts before touching the hot pan? That's action. It's chosen.
Okay.
Mises points out we humans can respond to things in both ways, reflexively and through deliberate action. The defining thing for action is that conscious choice, that intended outcome.
And he sees a link between this concept of rationality in our actions and how science itself works.
Yeah, it's an interesting parallel. He notes that all sciences, whether natural or social, fundamentally aim for a systematic, logical grasp of whatever they're studying.
Makes sense.
But he also points out a limit. You can keep breaking things down into smaller parts, but eventually you hit some fundamental building blocks, things you just can't analyze further.
The boundary to our knowledge.
And his point is, okay, there might be unknowable spheres out there, things beyond our comprehension, but those aren't relevant to the study of human action.
So praxeology, his term for the study of human action, sticks to what we can understand.
Exactly. It focuses on the categories of thought and action that are, proper to the human mind and how we actually apply them in the world. Its theorems are valid within that realm. It's not trying to describe unimaginable worlds.
It's about the logic of choice as we experience it.
Precisely.
Okay, so action is purposeful, is rational in that sense.
Yeah.
How do we actually study it then?
Right.
This is where praxeology comes in as the method.
Right. And the crucial idea here is that our understanding starts from within. We know what it means to act purposefully because we do it. We interpret our own intentions.
We have inside access to our own minds.
Kind of, yeah. And we use that understanding to interpret the actions of others, assuming they, too, are acting based on meanings and intentions. Mises is careful to say this isn't about, proving the existence of a soul or anything metaphysical.
It's more practical.
Yeah. It's about the shared logic of action. We understand others because we ourselves are actors. That's the core takeaway.
And this is why just applying methods from physics or chemistry directly to people doesn't quite work. Things like behaviorism.
Exactly. Because the stimulus in human action isn't just a physical event, it's filtered through meaning.
Yeah.
Remember Menger's commodity. Offering it for sale, that's a stimulus, sure, but it only works because of the meaning the buyer and seller attach to it, the value they perceive.
The interpretation matters.
Absolutely. Praxeology has to consider that subjective meaning. It can't just observe behavior like watching billiard balls collide. The purpose behind the action is the subject matter.
You can't ignore what the actor thinks is happening.
You really can't.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit then. Methodological individualism. It's the core idea there. Sounds a bit academic.
It can sound that way, but the idea is pretty straightforward, really, when we talk about groups, nations, companies, churches, whatever.
Collectives.
Right, collectives. Mises argues these things only really become understandable through the actions of the individuals who make them up.
So the group doesn't have a mind of its own.
Not in the way an individual does. The collective's actions are composed of the definite options of various people. It's not that the individual actions necessarily come first in time, but the collective is constituted by them.
So the collective is real. It influences things.
Oh, definitely. It's a real factor shaping events. But it's ultimately traceable back to individual choices and actions. Mises felt getting bogged down in debates about the precise philosophical nature of the collective was a kind of pointless pedantry.
So the practical insight is, look at the individuals involved.
That's the methodological approach, yes.
Okay. Let's shift gears slightly. Thinking about the impact of economic ideas themselves. Mises talks about how they help dismantle pre-capitalistic ways of thinking.
Yes, this is a really significant historical argument he makes. He suggests that a lot of the technological progress and, frankly, the increase in general welfare we've seen wouldn't have happened without the intellectual groundwork laid by classical liberal economics.
How so?
Well, these ideas weren't just theories. They actively challenged old laws, old customs, prejudices that were, holding back innovation. Think about things like guilds.
Right, restricting who could do what job.
Exactly. Or heavy-handed government controls, or even just social pressures against trying new business methods. Economic thinking provided arguments against those restrictions.
So economics acted as a kind of liberating force.
In a way, yes. It also changed how people viewed things. It arguably reduced the prestige of conquerors and warriors, and instead highlighted the benefits of peaceful trade and, well, just doing business.
Making things people want.
Mises goes so far as to say that many modern inventions might have just sat on shelves if the mindset hadn't shifted first, thanks to economists challenging those older ideas. He basically sees the Industrial Revolution as an offspring of this intellectual revolution.
Wow. So ideas really matter.
That's a key insight, yes. Ideas have consequences.
And one specific idea that got challenged was this notion that it's somehow wrong or unfair for someone to succeed by making a better or cheaper product.
Exactly. That shift, understanding that competition, where someone outperforms another by serving customers better, is actually beneficial. That was huge for developing market economies. It opened the door for innovation and, ultimately, lower prices for people.
Okay. Now things get a bit more abstract again when we talk about the epistemological problems, the challenges in knowing about human action.
Yeah, this is where debates can sometimes drift away from concrete examples and into pretty deep philosophical waters.
Oh, so?
Well, Mises contrasts economics with the natural sciences. In physics, for instance, if experiments consistently contradict the theory,
Like the old idea of phlogiston for fire.
right, or outdated mechanics, eventually the theory gets tossed out. It's falsified by experience.
But that's harder in economics.
It seems to be. This is a key point he makes. You can have the same complex event, say, a recession, and you'll find economists with completely opposing theories both claiming that event proves their theory right.
Huh. How does that happen?
Because human action is complex. There are so many potential factors, motives, interpretations. How you explain that recession often depends heavily on the theoretical framework you started with, your what Mises calls a prioristic reasoning. Your prior understanding shapes how you see the evidence.
So does that mean anything goes? That there's no real truth to find?
No, Mises doesn't go that far. He argues that our fundamental ways of thinking logic, the categories of action like means and ends, these do give us real, valid knowledge about the world, at least the part we interact with through action.
So reason itself tells us something about reality.
That's his view. He believes these basic logical structures are our ultimate source of knowledge, and that they are, in fact, adequate for understanding the world we act within. This knowledge isn't just from observing experiments, it comes from the structure of our minds, in a sense.
But he does accept we're not omniscient, right? Our intellect has limits.
Oh, absolutely. He's not claiming we have superhuman minds. Our understanding is conditioned by our human logical structure. But, and this is important, the sheer success of science and technology in helping us achieve our goals through action shows that radical skepticism, saying we can't know anything useful about this realm, is unfounded. We can understand enough to act effectively.
Okay, let's bring it back down to earth a bit. Labor, leisure, value. This feels more intuitive.
It does, doesn't it? And the basic observation is pretty simple. Most people, most of the time, find labor itself to be, well, a bit of a pain, a cost.
We prefer leisure, generally.
Generally, yes. We work because we value the return from that labor, the paycheck, the thing we produce, more than we value the leisure time we sacrifice to get it.
The trade-off.
Exactly. Now, why we feel this way might be a question for psychology or physiology. But for praxeology, it's just a given starting point. This is how people tend to operate.
So we're always mentally weighing. Is the reward for this next hour of work worth giving up an hour of free time?
And leisure isn't just nothingness. It's not just not working. It's something valuable in itself, an end we desire. Menger would call it an economic good of the first order directly satisfying a want.
And like other goods, it has diminishing marginal utility. That first hour off feels better than the 10th.
That's the idea, yes. And conversely, Mises points out, the disutility, the painfulness of labor tends to increase more sharply the longer you work. That last hour feels harder than the first.
Right. Okay, this leads us toward something really critical. Economic calculation. Especially the contrast with socialism. Mises saw this as a major blind spot for earlier economists.
He really did. It's a central theme in his work. He argued that many classical economists didn't fully grasp just how different economic calculation is in a market economy compared to a centrally planned one.
They just assumed socialists could figure it out somehow.
They often implicitly assumed it, yeah. Which suggested socialist plans were potentially feasible, that you could rationally allocate resources without markets.
And part of the problem was the labor theory of value not holding up.
That's a big part of it. If value really just came from labor hours, maybe you could calculate centrally, just add up the hours. But value is subjective, as we've discussed. And beyond that, even if you know all the technology, all the resources, that's not enough.
Why not? If you know how to make stuff and you have the stuff to make it with.
Because resources aren't perfectly interchangeable.
Okay.
A hammer isn't a screwdriver. This plot of land is good for wheat, that one for grazing. Means of production aren't perfectly substitutable or absolutely specific. There are always choices.
Choices about what to use where.
Exactly. How do you decide the best use for every tool, every machine, every worker, every piece of land to satisfy the most urgent wants of the population? Technology tells you how A leads to B. It doesn't tell you whether people want B more than they want C, which you could have made with the same resources.
That requires knowing relative values.
It requires economic calculation based on those subjective values, which in a market economy get expressed through prices. Technology describes cause and effect. It doesn't solve the economic problem of allocating scarcity.
And this distinction sharpens when we think about capital and income.
Absolutely. The very concept of capital, meaning privately owned means of production, used within a market system with prices to generate income, really only has its full meaning there.
So in a socialist system,
well, you still have the physical things, the factories, the machines, capital goods. But the economic concepts of capital and income as tools for calculation, for guiding production based on profitability, they become, well, Mises would say they become sort of academic exercises. They don't do anything in practice without private ownership and market prices.
Because there's no real profit and loss signal guiding decisions.
Precisely. Which links back to the entrepreneur's role in a market. They're constantly trying to figure out what consumers will want next and arranging production to meet that anticipated demand.
Which is risky.
Inherently uncertain, and their profits or losses directly reflect how well they guessed, how well they served those consumer wants, not just how much stuff they physically produce.
Okay. Another fundamental concept, time preference. The idea that sooner is better than later.
Right. It's a pretty universal human trait, isn't it? We generally prefer satisfaction now or in the near future compared to the exact same satisfaction way off in the distant future.
Waiting has a cost.
A disutility, yes. The further away the payoff, the more we discount it in our present valuation. This is the bedrock of the idea of interest.
And this affects production choices.
Definitely. Think about methods of production. Some take longer, but yield more output per unit of input, like planting an orchard versus growing annual vegetables.
The orchard takes years. but potentially produces more over time.
Exactly. You only choose that longer process if the expected future gain is big enough to outweigh the longer waiting period to compensate for that time preference.
And adopting those longer processes requires more capital.
Generally, yes. You need the resources available to sustain yourself and the production process during that longer waiting time. An increase in available capital goods makes longer, more productive methods feasible.
And again, whether something is a capital good depends on its use.
Flour for a baker is a capital good. Flour for you baking a cake at home is a consumer good. It's about the actor's plan, their perspective.
And deciding to save more, to allocate resources towards the future.
Necessarily means consuming less now. There's always that trade-off between present and future satisfaction.
So where does interest fit in precisely?
Mises talks about originary interest. This is that fundamental ratio, reflecting our preference for present goods over future goods. It's inherent in acting man. This underlying rate guides entrepreneurs. If a project's expected return doesn't beat that basic discount rate for time, it won't look profitable. It influences how long production periods will be.
So market interest rates we see are related to this.
They are manifestations of it, yes, influenced also by other factors like risk and the supply and demand for loanable funds. But changes in saving, investment, and interest rates are all tied together, reflecting shifts in how people collectively value present versus future goods.
Okay, understanding all these principles, rationality, calculation, time preference, leads Mises and others in this tradition to critique interventionism and socialism.
Yes. A major argument is that government interventions, especially things like price controls, mess up the signals that prices normally send.
They obscure the real picture.
Exactly. If you artificially hold down the price of, say, bread, producers might make less, shortages might appear, but the reason the suppressed price signal gets hidden. Mises uses the example of price controls in ancient Rome, contributing to the decline of cities by disrupting food supplies. The key insight is unintended consequences.
And socialism, as a system, faces a more fundamental problem from this viewpoint.
Right, because it aims to replace private ownership and markets entirely with central planning.
Abolishing the whole price mechanism.
And from the perspective we've been discussing, that removes the very possibility of rational economic calculation. Without market prices emerging from the voluntary exchanges of individuals based on their subjective values, how does the central planner know the best way to allocate resources? It's an information problem, fundamentally.
Of course, proponents of these systems see things differently.
Absolutely. Many see socialism, for instance, as potentially more rational, more just, precisely because it replaces the seeming chaos of the market with conscious planning. Or they see intervention as necessary to fix perceived flaws or injustices in the market outcome.
So it's a clash of fundamental views on how economies work, or should work.
It is. Mises' stance is that economic laws, like the law of supply and demand or the necessity of calculation, are like laws of nature. They describe inescapable interconnections. You have to work with them to achieve your goals, whatever those goals are. Ignoring them, even with good intentions, leads to problems.
He also pushes back against attributing all progress solely to unions or government.
Yes, he critiques the view that rising living standards and better working conditions are primarily due to government mandates or union pressure. He argues the main driver is actually increased capital investment per worker, better tools, better technology, which raises productivity and thus allows for higher real wages.
That increased capital comes from saving and investment.
Exactly. And he warned that policies, particularly in developing countries, that discourage entrepreneurship or capital accumulation, perhaps by importing interventionist policies from wealthier nations, could actually hinder the very progress they aim to achieve.
This has been incredibly rich. We've covered a lot of ground, from the nature of a simple commodity right through to complex critiques of economic systems. Can we maybe just quickly recap the absolute core takeaways from Menger and Mises here?
Sure. I think key points are goods become commodities through intent. Human action is fundamentally purposeful, hence rational in Mises' sense. Praxeology is the logic of that action. Meaningful economic calculation requires market prices reflecting subjective values. This makes central planning fundamentally problematic. And concepts like capital and interest are deeply tied to private property, markets, and time preference.
A really coherent framework when you lay it out like that. So thinking about all this, what's a final thought you'd want to leave with, someone listening to this deep dive?
Well, maybe consider how understanding these foundational ideas, even if you don't agree with every conclusion, provides a really powerful lens for looking at the economic arguments and policy debates happening right now.
Seeing the underlying logic, perhaps.
Exactly. Appreciating the logic of human action, the role of prices, the problem of calculation, the reality of time preference. It can help you analyze proposals and understand potential consequences in a perhaps deeper way than just focusing on the surface level goals. It encourages a more nuanced appreciation for the sheer complexity of it all.